we present Anthony Head reading Francis Durbridge's Paul Temple and the Tyler Mystery.
At about 10:30 on a Thursday evening, a prowl car of the Oxford Constabulary was patrolling the Chipping Norton Road a few miles outside the city. "Not much doing tonight," Sergeant Long remarked to the colleague at his side. "Payday tomorrow," Benson answered briefly. A short distance further on, a signpost with the words "Lay-by" swam up in the headlights. As they passed the bay at the side of the road, Benson screwed up his eyes to note the number of the solitary saloon car parked there. 4006 JDR. "Stolen vehicle," replied Long, quickly turning the wheel to position the police car directly in front of the black Jaguar Mark 7. Benson leapt out and pulled open the driver's door. Immediately he detected a whiff of a woman's perfume. The ignition key remained in the slot, and a neatly folded travel rug sat on the passenger seat. The petrol tank was half full. Moving to the rear of the car, Benson gripped the chrome handle and opened the lid. A young woman lay huddled on the corrugated rubber flooring. She was dressed as if she were going out for the evening, a green ballet-length dress, with a small handbag, necklace and bracelet to match. Round her neck, knotted with savage tightness, was a headscarf picturing well-known views of Paris. "You and I aren't going to get much sleep tonight, Sergeant," Benson said. Steve Temple stood in front of the fireplace in her new drawing room and tried to see it with the eyes of someone coming in for the first time. Did it look too much of a mixture? She and Paul had tried very hard to avoid the impersonal effect of a room that had been done by one of the fashionable London interior decorators. Since it was they themselves who were going to live in the flat, they decided to decorate and furnish it according to their own personal tastes. If George II had to rub shoulders with Louis XIV, then that was just too bad. It was barely a week since the Temples had moved into their Eaton Square flat. For months they'd been brooding over wallpapers and pastel shades, selecting carpets and the additional pieces of furniture needed for the more spacious rooms of their new residence. Yet when the carpets had been laid and each article had been moved into its predestined position, everything seemed just a little uneasy. Gradually during the past week, the correct place for every chair, table or cabinet had revealed itself to them. The flat was at last beginning to look like a home, but the result was that both Temple and Steve had itching fingers. They could not leave things alone. Now, before she could check herself, Steve moved impulsively to transfer a bowl of flowers from the top of a tall boy to a low occasional table. She was studying the effect with her head on one side when Temple's key sounded in the door of the flat. She heard it open and then close again with a comforting thud of a mass of mahogany going into place in an 18-inch thick wall. Temple's footsteps crossed the parquet floor of the hall without pausing, and she visualized him throwing his hat onto the table as he passed. As soon as he entered the room, she could tell by the expression on his face that the meeting with his agent had turned out successfully. But she knew him too well to expect him to burst out with the news immediately. He stopped, smiling at her, thinking how well the setting suited her. She had been created to stand against an Adam fireplace under a high ceiling, surrounded by the most skillful achievements of craftsmanship. Almost immediately his eye moved to the Queen Anne card table, standing now between two tall windows. Steve had moved it there since he'd gone out that morning. She studied his face anxiously. "How do you think it looks in that position?" Temple came into the middle of the room, eyeing the table judiciously. "That's just the right spot for it. Now that it's there, I can't imagine why we wanted to put it anywhere else." "I keep moving things and then putting them back again. Paul, do you think there'll ever come a time when we can say it's done? Sometimes I wonder if we've got the fidgets about the flat." Temple nodded towards the empty space above the fireplace. "When we find the right picture for that spot, we'll draw the deadline, shall we? Make it a rule that we shan't move anything for a month." "Good idea. Now then, what are you going to have to drink?" Steve walked to the huge bow-fronted corner cupboard and opened it with a flourish. Inside, a light went on and revealed 2 well-stocked shelves of bottles. Temple stopped with his lighter halfway to his cigarette. "By Timothy, there's enough booze there to sink a battleship." "I stocked up this morning. We shall need all this sooner or later, and it does look rather gay, doesn't it? Liqueurs, port and brandy on that shelf, bits and pieces for cocktails down here. What'll you have?" "I'll have a gin and Cinzano with a strong dash of Angostura bitters." While Steve was mixing the drinks, Temple glanced at the paper that Steve had discarded on the sofa. It was open at the page on which the Tyler murder was reported. She handed him his glass, chilled by a marble-sized lump of ice from a baby refrigerator built into the back of the cupboard. Temple met her eyes as she sipped it, toasting her silently. "It's wonderful to be able to get back home so quickly. I was with Watson only a quarter of an hour ago. If we were still living at the old place, I'd have probably lunched in town."
"How did you get on with Watson?"
Steve tried to make the question sound casual, though she knew Temple was holding something up his sleeve. "How would you like a trip to Paris?" he ventured completely out of the blue.
"Paul, do you really mean that?"
"I do. I've sold the film rights on my last book to an American company, and they want me to go over there to meet one of their producers, a Mr. Pastawake."
"Darling, how marvellous! I shall be able to buy some new clothes. I haven't a stitch to my back."
Steve parked her drink on the mantelpiece and put her arms round his neck. "If you haven't a stitch to your back," Temple retorted, "why did you insist on a built-in hanging cupboard running the whole length of your bedroom wall?"
"Fashions change, darling. Hadn't you heard about Balmain's exciting new line?"
"And hadn't you heard about the Chancellor of the Exchequer's boring old line?"
"We'll get around that. This man Pastawake will be reeking with dollars. You can ask him to give you an advance on the film rights. What day shall we go? We'll fly, of course. Can we stay at the Pompadour again? I love being near the Champs-Élysées."
As she talked, Steve disengaged herself from Temple and with apparent casualness picked up the paper from the sofa and pushed it in amongst the other periodicals in the magazine rack. Temple watched her with amusement. He could see perfectly clearly what was going on in her mind. "You needn't bother, Steve. I've seen it already."
"Seen what, darling?"
"The report of the Tyler murder."
"The Tyler murder? What's that?"
Steve knew he'd seen through her, but for the sake of appearances she kept up the deception a little longer. He reached for the paper, opened it, and read aloud. "Police are baffled by the case which has already become known as the Tyler mystery. Blonde, pretty Betty Tyler, 24, was found strangled the night before last. She worked at the Oxford Salon of Mariano, a fashionable Mayfair beauty parlour, whence she had recently been transferred from London." Steve interrupted.
"That's the Courier. Have you seen the Echo?"
"Not yet."
"Let me read it to you. Scotland Yard has been called in by the Chief Constable of Oxford. Interviewed today at the Yard, Sir Graham Forbes denied a report that approaches had been made to Paul Temple, the well-known novelist and criminologist. Knowledgeable observers, however, reaffirm that this case sets precisely the kind of problem in which Temple has so often assisted the police in the past."
Temple's eyes were thoughtful for a moment. Then he knocked his drink back and carried the empty glass to the corner cupboard. "That's just journalistic patter. I've no intention of becoming involved in the Tyler affair. We've enough on our plate as it is, Steve."
"That's exactly what I think. When I read about this, I felt certain Sir Graham would ask for your help."
"So you hid the paper? Did you honestly think I wouldn't notice?"
"Not really." Steve grimaced at him impishly. "But I don't want to miss out on that Paris trip."
"It's all right," Paul assured her. "The Tyler case won't upset our Paris plans."
"I wish I could be certain about that,"
Steve replied ruefully. Her expression had become moody. She fiddled absent-mindedly with the flowers she'd arranged in a nearby bowl.
"I have the funniest feeling it's going to upset our plans very much."
"You and your intuition. How often does it really mean anything?" Steve straightened up with a frown of mock sternness.
"More often than you're prepared to admit to yourself, Mr. T."
The following Wednesday was the first day of summer. Not the calendar summer, but the true summer, whose coming is like a thief in the night. No man can foretell it. Temple was glad that his business took him along New Bond Street. The thoroughfare was crisp and gay in the warm morning sunshine. The slow-moving cars sparkled, and after a chilly spring, every woman worth her salt had come forth in a new summer creation. Every Mayfair man had reduced his habitual vigilance against the climate. Umbrellas had been left at home, and though the bowler could not be discarded without affronting protocol, it was being carried in the hand rather than being worn on the head. Temple himself had greeted the coming of summer by purchasing half a dozen bow ties at Madingley's, and had changed into one at the shop. He called at Justerini and Brooks, and over a glass of Conquistador sherry discussed with his wine merchant the vintages which he was going to lay down at the Eaton Square flat. His way back to Berkeley Square, where he'd parked the Fraser Nash, took him past Anderson's art gallery. Although his thoughts were on Chateau bottle clarets, he had seen a picture in the window that he rather liked the look of that would go perfectly in that gap above the fireplace. He walked past slowly and stood studying the picture in the window with half-closed eyes. Though it was the only painting in the window, it was displayed rather artificially on an easel, and the drapings behind it were distracting. Temple could not easily visualize it on his own drawing-room wall. On an impulse, he walked into the shop. The moment he crossed the threshold, he entered a world of decorous coolness and silence. The light in here was subdued after the sunshine outside, and his feet were cushioned by a thick carpet of a discreet buff shade. There were pictures everywhere, mostly modern. His eye was attacked by stark Gauguin-esque jibes at the female form and vivid fantasias on Oriental or Hispanic landscapes. "Good morning, sir." The voice might have come from a radio set. It was musical and carefully modulated. Its tone managed to suggest that the speaker was prepared to proffer the courtesy title of sir to his customers, but they must not infer thereby that he was in any sense inferior to them socially. The voice had come from behind Temple. He turned around. The young man was quite as tall as Temple, and met his scrutiny unblinkingly. He wore a very well-tailored suit of dark grey flannel with a horizontal stripe, which Temple found a shade too bold. His shirt was of cream silk, and the cuffs emerged just the correct distance from his coat sleeve. When he put a hand up to brush back a straying curl from his brow, a set of gold cufflinks was revealed, stamped with some unchallengeable crest. "Can I show you something, sir?" the assistant immediately asked as Paul entered. "Indeed you can," Paul indicated the picture in the window. "Oh yes, the Capel study of Portmanec. I thought it might be a Ralduffi." "Very much the same style, sir." The young man looked at Temple with a little more interest. "You like it?" "That's rather hard to say. As a picture I like it very much, but I'm wondering how it will look on the wall of my drawing-room." "That's easily settled." The salesman had evidently decided from the cut of Temple's jib that he was a customer and not merely a sightseer. "We can send it round and you can try it. If you don't like the picture, you can notify us and it will be taken away again. No obligation to you at all." Seeing that the suggestion did not please Temple as much as most customers, he added, "Alternately, I can have it hung in our display room right away." "I think that's a better idea." "Mr. Tripp, will you bring the Capel that is in the window into the display room? If you'll come this way, sir." He led Temple to a three-sided space at the back of the shop. One wall consisted of a number of hinged panels, so that the approximate colour of any room could be provided as a background to the picture displayed. "What colour is your drawing-room, sir?" "Well," Temple hesitated, "I suppose you'd call it a duck-egg blue." "Something like that?" "Near enough." The young man offered Temple a cigarette, while the assistant laboured by with the picture and hung it on the wall slightly askew-whiff. "I like it," Paul said as soon as he saw the picture on the wall. "I can see what's wrong now. It's the frame. It won't work in our drawing-room. Most of our furniture is antique, you see." The other man's eyebrows raised just a fraction, but he gave no other sign of his opinion of people who mingled modern art with antique furniture. He was too good a salesman. Temple interpreted his expression correctly, but ignored it. "That's easily dealt with, sir," he said, and led Paul to a corner filled with frame samples. Paul eventually selected a grey moulding flecked with gilt. "It'll take a day or two to make up the frame, sir. We'll send the account in due course. And the name and address?" "Temple, 127A Eaton Square." "Paul Temple?" "Correct." The young man produced his card. "Just in case there's any query," he said. Paul glanced at it. It bore the handwritten name of Stephen Brooks. "Well, thank you for your help." "Not at all, sir. I hope I may have the pleasure again some day." Even at the time, Paul was puzzled by the peculiar emphasis he placed on these words. Temple drove himself home, his thoughts so occupied with his purchase that he did not pay any particular attention to the black Humber parked a little way down the street from his own entrance. He let himself into the flat, but before he could burst into the drawing-room, Charlie, the Temple's cook, butler, handyman, and watchdog, emerged from the door leading to his own quarters. "Hold it, Mr. T." Charlie's voice was hushed and conspiratorial. Temple tried to hide the annoyance he always felt when addressed by initial. The 30-year-old Cockney was a faithful and irreplaceable servant, but his familiarity sometimes bordered on insolence. "What is it, Charlie?" "I've a message for you. It's from Mrs. T." "From Mrs. Temple? Has she gone out?" "No, she's in there." Charlie ignored the reproof implied in Temple's correction and stabbed a finger towards the closed drawing-room door. "But Sir Graham Forbes and that Inspector Vosper are here. She told me to warn you so as you could start thinking up your defence." Temple smiled to himself as he laid a hand on the doorknob. There was no need for Steve to worry. He had a good idea what had brought Sir Graham to the flat, but he was as determined as she was not to be diverted from that trip to Paris. The knob turned under his hand as someone opened the door from the inside. It was Steve. During the moment while the door screened them, she shook one finger at him in a gesture of warning. "Ah, there you are at last, darling," Steve said loudly as Paul walked in. "Look who's come to visit us." Sir Graham was facing the wall at the far side of the room, scrutinizing the picture hung there through a monocle which he used like a magnifying glass. Detective Inspector Vosper had declined, as always, to remove his overcoat. As Temple entered, he rose to his feet and nodded, but left all the talking to his superior. "Temple!" boomed Sir Graham Forbes in the vibrant voice which in days long past he developed in the forecourt of Buckingham Palace. "Good to see you again. I was telling Steve I like the way you've done this place up. It's honest, reflects your personalities. None of this nonsense, the Louis XIV salon or the Marie Antoinette boudoir. What wonderfully proportioned rooms these old houses have. I was just trying to figure out this painting. Looks like one of those Venetian fellows. It's original, of course." The picture that had attracted Forbes' attention was a modest canvas about 18 inches by 12. It represented a wild, prophetic head with flaming cheeks and turbulent red hair. "As a matter of fact, you put your finger on the gem of the bunch. That's a Tiepolo, John the Baptist." "Is it indeed?" Sir Graham turned on his heel to quiz the picture again. "I was just telling Sir Graham about our plans to visit Paris, darling," Steve said pointedly, and Temple spotted Vosper's sudden embarrassed glance at Sir Graham. "What'll you drink, Paul?" "Same as usual, please. Steve has looked after you, Sir Graham. Inspector?" The two men lifted their well-filled glasses to show that Steve had not failed to show them hospitality. With a twinkle in his eye, Temple watched Sir Graham move round the back of the sofa until he occupied the commanding position in front of the fireplace. It was the stance he habitually took up when he was about to broach some difficult business. Forbes was an old friend of the Temples. He was a splendid example of an Englishman who has been shaped by the successive processes of school, university, military service, and public office. He was still handsome enough to attract the glances of women, and when men saw him they were reminded of the older man who features in advertisements for gentlemen's clothing. Broad shoulders, bristling grey moustache, bushy eyebrows, and an aura of unshakable confidence and authority. "Well, Sir Graham, what brings you here? Did you and Vosper forsake Scotland Yard to admire our interior decoration?" Paul asked. "Well," admitted Sir Graham, rocking his weight slightly to and fro and studying the liquid in his glass, "not entirely, I must admit. Have you heard anything lately of a character called Harry Shelford?" "Harry Shelford?" Temple repeated the name thoughtfully as he accepted the cocktail glass Steve handed him. He remembered Harry Shelford distinctly. He was a likeable bad lot who'd been mixed up in a fraud case 4 years earlier. Temple had become involved in the investigations and was partly responsible for his being sentenced to 2 years in jail. On his release, Harry Shelford's first action had been to call on Temple and ask him for a loan of £400. He intended, he said, to give up crime and go back to his old job. His idea was to open up a chemist's business in South Africa. Temple was so surprised and amused by the request that he lent Harry the money. 12 months later, to his astonishment, he received payment in full. "No, I haven't heard anything from him or about him for over a year now. Why are you interested in him?" "So far as you know, he hasn't returned to this country." Temple shook his head. If he'd done so, I'm sure he would have got in touch with me, if only for another loan. Sir Graham glanced towards Vosper and finished his whisky. Steve moved to replenish it, but he said, "No more for me now, thank you, Steve," and held onto his empty glass. "And what do you know about this Tyler affair?" "I've read the headlines, that's about all." "It's an interesting problem," Sir Graham said in his most beguiling tone. "Just your cup of tea, in fact." "I'd rather not get involved, Sir Graham. We've had quite a time settling into this flat, and as you know, Steve and I are planning a trip to Paris. Suppose Harry Shelford is mixed up in this case. Would you change your mind?" Sir Graham knew Paul had a soft spot for the criminal. "What makes you think he is?" Sir Graham looked down at Vosper and nodded. The inspector opened the notebook he had been holding